Hey. Boker Tov, everyone. This is Rabbi Noah Farkas from Valley Beth Shalom. Welcome to the Sunday Schmooze. Sorry, we're just a few minutes late. We had a little issue with one of our streaming keys, and it's nice to see everyone on this beautiful June morning here in my backyard. I'm here with Nick Holton, who is the chair of the positive psychology over at Milken, and we'll be talking in just a minute. I want to just go through a few announcements about what's coming up at Valley Beth Shalom. So as always, our Valley Beth Shalom at Home community continues to thrive online. Tonight, there's Minyan at 6 p.m. But earlier than that, at 4 p.m. this afternoon is our Songs of Protest to the Jewish Voice backyard concert with Cantor Phil Barron. That should be excellent. And then Minyans at 6, followed by meditation tonight at 7 p.m. This coming week, we have our Chazak program, which is our active adult community about cybersecurity for seniors, especially as all of you are moving online very quickly, which is really great to see. A number of other programs happening that day too, followed by Minyan in the evening and our family night. Every Monday night is some kind of family program. We've got trivia night coming up at 7 p.m. So hopefully you can register on Monday by Monday afternoon for that. Tuesday, we have Pirkei Avot again. Wednesday, please join me and Rabbi Feinstein in the evening for a special guest appearance by two of my very good friends who are African-American pastors here in Los Angeles to talk about everything that's happening in the wider world, and here specifically in LA around Black Lives Matter and the sort of civil protests that are happening for racial justice. Very excellent conversation. Looking forward to having that. Earlier than that, at 6 p.m., please join us for our partnership with the Jews United for Democracy and Justice speaker series. With Mayor Garcetti will be on with us for that. So very excellent civic night on Wednesday night. Thursday, we have Minyan in the morning. And in the evening, we have Rabbi Joshua Hoffman's wonderful class on prayer, Introduction to Liturgy, called Prayer Mastery. And then on the horizon, and that's at 7 p.m. So please join us for that. And then later on in the horizon, we have other things all happening this summer. We're trying to do some arts. We're trying to do some music. So we have a paper cutting workshop. We have other types of things coming up. So there's so much happening at Valley Beth Shalom. And the last announcement I'll just give in general is that we are getting very close to reopening. And there'll be a whole handbook that will be coming out for that. We have been preparing the campus every single day to prepare inviting each and every one of you on campus. So we hope that you'll be able to join us just at the soonest that we can. So it's very good to have everyone here. If you're online with us, go ahead and just type in good morning. Let us know where you're coming from so that we can see that you're here. As I welcome Nick here to my backyard for the Sunday Schmooze. Nick, it is really good to see you. How are you, friend?
It's great to see you. I'm doing well. As you can tell, sitting in a beautiful spot up here in northern Michigan at my parents' cottage and relaxing. It's been nice.
That's great. No, I know I have family that's from Michigan. So you have to show me where in Michigan are you?
All right, let's make sure I do this. Yeah, that looks right in the camera there. So we are, go backwards. We're about right up here, just 2 hours north of Grand Rapids. So that right here, do it this way. Right there is Lake Michigan.
Beautiful. I hope you're enjoying your early summer break as you transition a little bit. And so you are an expert, even though you probably don't necessarily always feel like you are an expert, because none of us do.
That's correct, yeah.
It's called the imposter syndrome. I've studied some
stuff. Absolutely, yep.
But you are an expert in positive psychology. So can you give me like the elevator pitch? Like if we walk into the elevator, there's a 40-floor building, we just push up, and now tell me what is positive psychology?
Yeah. So the real quick version is it's the empirical study of human flourishing. So that oftentimes gets sort of whittled down to happiness or well-being. It's definitely more complex and more holistic than that. But it's just one scientific field that tries to help human beings better understand and figure out how to, the word you use for VBS right now is thrive. So that not only means feel good, not all of the time. We can thrive even when we're experiencing some unpleasant emotion, but also perform at a high level and function and operate on a high level as well. So it's really sort of a holistic look at feeling good, doing good, performing at a high level.
Oh, that's great. And how did you come to this though?
It's been a long road, but I always tell people I can actually trace it back somewhat to sixth grade, and I was a semi decent soccer player, and I have two younger sisters, and the youngest, my sister Sarah, um, let's say she was blessed with other skills, maybe besides athleticism. She was a performing arts person, and I was sort of flipped. So when she was younger and started playing soccer, I pulled her out in the driveway one morning and showed her a couple things. I guess she would have been in second grade at this time. And then she went out, she had a game later that day, and she scored a couple of goals against this big bruiser of a boy that was kind of marked up against her. And then, little old me, who didn't understand the difference between a correlation and a cause, looked at that and was like, oh, I did that, right? I helped made that happen. And it felt really nice. And so that's a long way of saying my first introduction to sort of helping somebody get better or improve themselves in some way that was valuable to them. That was my first shot sort of in the arm of like, ooh, I like that experience. That feels nice. And so then in high school, I had awesome relationships with my teachers. I have an uncle in particular who was an athletic director and let me job shadow him my freshman year. And I realized, oh, well, teaching is a way to get that feeling all the time, right? To work with people, young people who are malleable and open and want to grow. And so I decided to go into education. The next question was, what do you teach? And I said, oh, I like history. I'm good at history. So I got a bachelor's degree in history from Michigan State. And that wasn't quite what I was looking for. So eventually I went back for my master's and still had this kind of intellectual itch. Like, how do I get to the bottom of how to help people more? Cars coming by here, but how to help people grow and sort of advance to these higher levels. We'll talk a little bit about Maslow in a minute here. And then that wasn't it either. So eventually, finally went back for my PhD in educational psychology, and that's where I stumbled across positive psych and this sort of science devoted to those processes, along with other sciences like neuroscience and cognitive psychology and things of that nature. But it all really boils down to just I'm sort of hooked on and addicted to that feeling of helping other people improve and get better.
Now, when I think of psychology, I tend to think that people go to psychologists because something's broken, right? I lost my job. My kids don't talk to me. I don't have my friends, right? And I go to a psychologist so I can feel better or deal with a tragedy and rework it into the schema of my life so that it feels my life is manageable again, right? When I think of psychology, it's usually something to do with a loss of control and trying to bring that control back. But that's not what positive psychology is about. So maybe talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, no, that's a great framing. And in many ways, so positive psych is sort of a paradigm shift, right? To your point. So, back in the late 1990s, 1998, I believe, Professor Martin Seligman, who now runs the Positive Psychology Center at the University of Pennsylvania, sort of along with a few other scholars, coined this term positive psychology. And he was the president of the APA at the time. And he basically put out this argument. And he said, we've spent decades studying how to make miserable people less miserable, right? It took in numerical terms to how to move them sort of from a -5 to a 0, help them be content, almost sort of neutral, existing, just not suffering, right? Eliminate the languishing. And what he said was, we need to develop an empirical field, a really rigorous study of how to do the other end of that, how to not just fix the bad, but how to build the good, how to cultivate engagement, motivation, positive emotion, a sense of meaning, deepen and develop our relationships, achieve on a high level, things of that nature. And so the subsequent 3 decades or so of study has been sort of this advent of positive psych, which is a terrible name. And I don't really know any positive psychologists who really like the name, because it sort of implies all other psych is negative. Obviously not the case, but To your point, that is the paradigm shift. We really focus on how to try to build the good and actively move towards flourishing, right? And this is so useful, I think, for a lot of people, because this is essentially the two modes that human beings operate in. Like when we try to satisfy core needs, we really do it from the standpoint of avoiding the bad or building the good, right? So if you're trying to get an existence needs, basic survival, right? You avoid the saber-toothed tiger, right? Or you pursue food, but they are both in service of, survival and existence, right? And so I think it's similar that way.
Wow, that's cool. Of course, you're making me think of what the psalmists wrote thousands of years ago. In one of the psalms, it said, "Sorme ra, the kachtov, the voseh shalom v'rod fehu." So it says, like, turn away from evil and try to seize the good, and to make peace and pursue after it, right? So that's the two frameworks, right?
Yep. And both are important. Both matter, right? We have to use both. But to your point, we spend a lot of time, because of our sort of bias towards the negativity, just trying to avoid and escape that. And we're not always consciously focusing on building the good.
Yeah. It's so fascinating to me. Listen, there's about 20 people online right now. If any of you who are watching this online on Facebook or on YouTube would like to ask Dr. Nick Holton a question, either about positive psychology, maybe how we use it in our current circumstances, we'll be talking about all of that. But I want to invite you into this conversation. So go ahead and type a comment, especially on the Facebook page, and I'll read it off to him, and we'll have a whole discussion about it.
Great.
So, Nick, I want to ask you though, so positive psychology sounds like, I don't know, it sounds like you're taking all of life and turning it into science, like a science experiment.
Yeah.
Almost as if you gamify life. Like, if I can do 2 more points of this and like do this little thing over here, I'm guaranteed that I'm going to win the game, right? That's what it sounds like a little bit. Maybe you can demystify that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned that a lot of folks don't really love the name positive psychology because, again, in Dr. Seligman's words, it sounds like happyology, just sort of like think positive thoughts. And this is something we actively as psychologists have to sort of push back against and demystify. To your point, a lot of times I'll have students, teens, all the way up to adults come into the class thinking that we're just going to learn how to think happy thoughts. And there are some skills, we'll talk about them, such as cognitive reframing, that can help us do some of those things. And we spend a lot of time in the science of happiness and a lot of time in the science of optimism. But ultimately, this is really, really rigorous, peer-reviewed stuff. The most probably common big takeaway from positive psych is the gratitude journal, which a lot of people have heard about, right? Well, the gratitude journal came out of random assignment, placebo-controlled trials. I mean, it's the same way we test pharmaceuticals, right? This isn't just sort of, think good things and the whole world will change. This is not manifestation in that way, right? This is really, really rigorously studied.
Yeah. Yeah, just for those of you who belong to Valley Beth Shalom, know that we put a gratitude journal in our Purim Mishloach Manot this year, which is our gifts we give to everyone. We hand delivered almost 2,000 little packages across the entire city. And in fact, we had to mail a few outside the city for people who belong to VBS who aren't actually living here in LA. And we purposely put a daily gratitude journal, about 100 days, like 100 pages, 100 days.
That's great. Yeah, it's really, really fascinating stuff. I mean, gratitude does all sorts of things, from improved sleep, boost positive emotion. It changes the structure of the brain in interesting ways. Fascinating stuff. So
just one more philosophical point, and then we're going to go right into some skills. Okay? We got an airplane going overhead.
Yep, it's LA, right? Van Nuys Airport, I imagine.
So when you say happiness and thriving and flourishing, right? I mean, I don't know if you know this, but I have a background in Western philosophy. So like, you're immediately kicking up Aristotle when you say Nicomachean ethics or eudaimonian ethics, and talking about like the concept of eudaimonia was never about being cheerful. Like, we're not all a bunch of Care Bears as much as we'd like to be, right? It's really about dealing with life and living. I like to say, like, sort of like a life on fire, or the most vibrant, like turning the technicolor of life all the way up. So that, yeah, you feel the lowest lows in a very deep way, but you also feel the highest highs in a very deep way. And I think Aristotle is trying to get at that somewhat in his book. And I certainly think rabbinic literature is replete with just trying to have people live more, be more alive,
Yeah.
right? So that's the philosophical point, is that it's not about being happy all the time. It's not like we want to medicate ourselves against sadness, because sadness is part of the spectrum of emotion. It's it's about living fully, right? And by the way, the Schulmans say hello. I see Nancy just wanted to
Schulman. Oh, the Schulmans. Yeah. Hey, Schulman fam.
So let's
There's,
talk. Yeah,
there's
go
a
ahead.
couple points there, and it's funny you bring it up because eudaimonia is really the reason I got into positive psych. So when I was in my PhD program, I really thought I was going to be looking at intrinsic motivation. I was looking at a lot of students and thinking, this person has this intense passion and creativity and drive, and this person looks miserable in the room. What's the difference, right? And so I started looking at intrinsic motivation, and that eventually led me to eudaimonia and the difference between that and hedonia and other different types of happiness, right? So it does come from that philosophical tradition. And right now I'll mention that when I say flourishing, the model that we tend to use in this field for the most part comes out of UPenn, and it's an acronym that everybody can write down, pretty simply, but it's PERMA V or PERMA H, PERMA, right? V or H, whichever you use. And that stands for positive, and to your point, and negative emotion. We have to have the negative. It's yin and yang. It helps us sort of conceptualize and make sense of the world. It helps us appreciate the good, right? How do I know that it's a bright, sunny, beautiful day? Because a couple days ago it was in the 40s, right? And it was raining. Okay, you've got to have sort of that juxtaposition. And there's a great book, if people are interested in that, called The Upside of Your Dark Side by Todd Kashdan, a professor at George Mason, and Robert Biswas-Diener, one of the early sort of positive psychologists and studiers of happiness, that speaks to that point, living wholly, right? Not just trying to eliminate the bad all the time, but creating a lot of good and buffering against it, right? So that's flourishing. And to that point, you can be flourishing even when unpleasant things are happening, right? And sometimes we actually need the unpleasant things to happen in order to sort of kind of level up. And some of your viewers and you yourself may be aware of the Rabbi Dr. Tversky video where he talks about how lobsters grow. Some of you have seen this, right? The idea that a lobster, that fleshy tissue bumps up against the rigid shell, making the lobster very uncomfortable. And that's its signal that it's time to go shed the shell, grow its tissue, and develop a new shell, right? So the impetus literally sometimes for us to grow is that we actually feel uncomfortable, right? And I think we're experiencing a lot of that right now, sort of in the greater social context as well, whether it be fear, guilt, sadness, anger. These are emotions that are motivating people towards positive behaviors, at least in my mind. But they're coming from an unpleasant place. They're coming from a lot of discomfort.
So let's talk about that a little bit. Like, we are in the midst of this global pandemic that even though it's summertime and we all want to just like be free of it, it's not like it doesn't exist, right? We have over 2 million cases in the United States, and about 110 to 115,000 people in the US have died because of this pandemic. And it's really horrible. But it's that could set this like sense of despair in, or almost this sense of second or willed naivete that like, oh, it's not going to happen to me, so I'm just going to do whatever I want, sort of as a breaking free, right? And then in addition to that, we've had now in its third week the longest sustained protest movement this country has seen since 1968, and that is also bringing this whole other level of uncertainty that is everything to do with the pandemic and nothing to do with the pandemic at the same time. So what can we learn from all of these really uncomfortable, almost despairing moments from positive psychology, to either address this moment or how an individual who's wrapped up in these things can feel? Can you just speak to that for a minute?
Yeah, well, I'll mention a couple things. One, I want to reference and there's some debate around this idea, sort of mathematically how it lays out, but there is something to be considered in terms of the ratio of positive to negative emotion, right? So we mentioned we do need some negative, right? But we run into a problem if we're sitting in that negative too much, too intensely for too long. That's where the body and the brain go into allostasis. It becomes very toxic to us. So we want to be trying to buffer against that, right? Which is difficult right now, given everything going on. So I'll mention something from a great book called Hardwiring for Happiness by Dr. Rick Hanson. He's a neuroscientist. And he has this great line where he mentions sort of what we pay attention to sort of acts as a spotlight in a vacuum, right? What we look at and direct our attention to spotlights it, right? And then the brain sort of sucks that up. And it sucks it up even more and even faster if it's something negative, because we have to pay attention to these sort of threats and these signals, right? Well, that's really, really powerful for us because it suggests the following. We need to pay attention to what we're paying attention to, okay? Yes, there is a pandemic that's scary, that incites fear, that incites frustration for a lot of people, that incites loneliness because we're so socially isolated, physically isolated. And at the same time, there's an alternate reality out there, right? There's another sort of way of looking at it. And that is anytime where we sense that threat, it also has a tendency to crystallize what's really important to us, what's really meaningful to us. It has an ability to sort of help us reprioritize sort of our goals, our objectives, our relationships. I'll give you a simple example. I have no idea if any of them are on right now, but I have a very, very close group of 7 guy friends that we lived with each other variously throughout college and high school. When the pandemic started, we started doing a Zoom and a Hangout every Thursday. And about 2 or 3 weeks in, and I know a lot of people have done this, we stopped and said, like, why did it take a pandemic for us to start doing this, right? To connect with each other and catch up every week. And does that mean the fear goes away, the frustration goes away? No, but it's also a way of taking the bad and making the best of it, right? Reframing it, paying attention to some other elements of it and saying, okay, I got to worry about this, but it's also opened up some things that are really positive. And this is called cognitive reframing, just sort of changing the way we look at things. And the simplest way to do that for anyone watching is to just stop and ask the following simple sort of question. What's another way of looking at it, right? The way we frame things ultimately determines our emotional response, right? It's called the ABCs: adversity, belief, consequences. And that a lot of times determines our behavioral response as well. So slowing down and just saying, what are some other ways to view this situation, I think is a really critical tool to sort of find that balance here. The other thing I'll mention is both the pandemic and the protests, I think, really speak to that R and that M in PERMA, our relationships and a sense of meaning. Right? So relationships are the #1 predictor of happiness, right? Along with meaning, both highly, highly predictive of happiness and well-being. And meaning, sort of kind of the loose version of it, is just self-transcendence, right? A belief in something more significant than our own individual selves, right? And I think when you look at the protests, I think when you look at the civil unrest and sort of societal implications, when you look at the pandemic itself, this is really forcing people to step back and say, yeah, what's important, but also how am I as an individual a part of something greater than myself? It's ethics of the fathers, 114, right? If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I, right? And I would argue we, especially in this country and the sort of the cultural attitude, spend a lot of time on the first part of that and not always quite enough time on the second part, right? Like, who and what am I for besides my own individual self? And we're seeing a lot of that right now. I mean, 300 million people basically shut down and said, okay, I'm going to stay in, not only for my own safety, but for the safety of the people around me, right? That's a meaningful, transcendental sort of action and behavior to take.
I definitely think you're right. You're obviously right in so many levels, but I definitely think that so much of American culture tries to look for that reframing, right? And cognitive reframing, though, is usually given over to pundits. And that's one of the problems that I think we face as a divisive country, is that every event as it unfolds before us gets cognitively reframed as a left or a right political movement. And it's one of the problems that I have with the current media apparatus, is that they've taken the best of psychology and kind of warped it into a weapon. And and going back to your earlier comment about like really paying attention to what we're paying attention to, like it's where critical, classic liberal critical thinking becomes absolutely necessary, so that when you see an event and unfolding, you don't immediately go to your cognitive reframer, who is your leftist or your rightist, your fascist or your anti-fascist, your progressive or your conservative, your whatever it is, right? Person to do it for you. You have to do it yourself. Like that's one of the major, I think that's one of the major psychological ills of our current situation, is that we've outsourced our cognitive reframing to other people.
Yep.
Now,
And we're lazy too. Human beings, like, I mean, and not, not just sort of randomly, we sort of are incentivized to be lazy, to conserve energy and to be efficient, right? And to be smart about things. And it's called the path of least resistance. It's something we cover in my classes as well. But to your point, when we experience that cognitive dissonance, we sort of run to whoever our pundit is, right? And I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, and just sort of say, okay, fix this for me, right? I experienced this dissonance. This feels uncomfortable. I'm noticing that lobster. I'm bumping up against my shell. And in that exact moment, we have the opportunity to sort of succumb to it, right? And confirm our own biases or grow. And the way we grow is usually by leaning into that discomfort, right? So I personally, and I think I know you know this because you've come in and done some presentations for us, but I also taught a sort of high school level sociology class. And one of the things I told them, and that I actively try to do, is when I see an issue unfolding or an opinion out there, the first thing I do is run to the pundits who are going to say the opposite of what I already think. Right. And that's not enjoyable for me. That's really uncomfortable. It creates a lot of anger. My wife will tell you right now, I've been experiencing a lot of negative emotion the last few weeks, and that can be hard to handle. But it's so important to get outside of that echo vacuum. But it takes the willingness to lean into the discomfort and the willingness to put in the effort and not just follow the paths of least resistance.
Yeah, I agree with that. So we have a few questions coming in from online, and go ahead and ask them. Susan Brooks, who's a wonderful sort of activist and teacher, she wants to know, how do you use positive psychology as a practitioner if you're not a professor? Like, what other career paths can you utilize positive psychology? And then I'll just ask both questions. Robin Melameth, who's a member of our congregation who is also a teacher, asks, are there resources for teaching elementary age children the principles of positive psychology that are developmentally appropriate for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds as opposed to high school students? So I'll group those together and answer them however you will.
Well, let me do the second one first, and then I'll ask you to maybe remind me of the first one again. But for the second one, was it Robin that
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to point you to a couple of things. So, Noah mentioned at the start, but I'm at the outgoing chair of Pause Ed at Milken Community Schools, and I'll be the incoming associate director of Pause Ed at the Shipley School in Philadelphia, which is where Dr. Seligman sends his child to go to school. Adam Grant sends his children to go to school, and sort of the Pause Ed school in the United States. As far as that's concerned. And so they have a lot of great resources. You can check it out, called The Shipley School. And then perhaps even better than that, because they started it 15 years ago, is a school in Melbourne, Australia called the Geelong Grammar School. And they have, since the start of COVID, have been posting well-being resources. And the reason I mentioned both of these schools is they're K through 12. Right? So they're starting to implement some of these ideas like gratitude and optimism and kindness and strengths with really young kids early on. And it's critically important to do so because we know that's when the brains are the most plastic, right? That's when they're the most open and spongy and malleable. So both of those schools can give you a lot of resources, but I think you've shared my email and social media, and they're welcome to email or DM me as well, and I can try and point them to some others. The first one was practitioner, right? Okay. So this is a relatively new field. It's fairly young, especially in the United States, as it happens to be with a lot of things. The US is lagging behind a little bit on this. That said, it's starting to pick up pace. And what you can find is a few different avenues. Positive psych is starting to be taught more in high schools, right? Somewhat in elementary schools, but certainly high schools. So I work with an individual in Michigan, a great guy, Casey Marin is his name, that just got the first, to my knowledge, positive psych class put into the public school system in Romeo schools, which is sort of like kind of suburban Detroit area, a little outside of that. So you might consider trying to bring a course like this to your school, right? There's also a sort of an up and coming field that I just love and am fascinated with called positive organizational systems. And this is sort of a fusion of positive psychology and organizational psychology. And it really looks at, if you kind of think of positive psych 1.0 is like positive psych for me, right? Then positive psych 2.0 is positive psych for thee and for we. What does it look like on a systems level, a group level, a community level? Because what we know is our happiness, our habits, our productivity, our achievement, they are completely interrelated with the people around us, right? We are totally interdependent, whether we want to accept it or believe it or not. So thinking about these issues on a communal or group level is really, really, really important. And again, that's where you'll get into great work by people like Adam Grant. There's an awesome book right now called Transcend by Scott Barry Kaufman. And he's basically the expert on Maslow, okay, on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And what this is an update to Maslow's hierarchy. And what he is arguing is that when we get to the peak of that pyramid, and not that there's one point in time, but as we get to that peak, self-actualization, what it does is it enables transcendence. It enables us to actually say, okay, I've got to sort of where I want to be or feel good about myself. I may dip, I may need to keep working on it, but for the most part, I've taken care of what I need to take care of. I'm self-actualizing. So now I can really put my focus on meaning and purpose and other people, right? So that's positive organizational systems, positive psych in schools. And then there's always just, coaching. I always tell people I'm not a therapist, I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't try to deal with depression or extreme stress or anxiety disorders. But there are a lot of people who are interested in other ways and skills and tools for building sort of a stronger life. And that's a skill set that positive psych can be applied to as well.
So will you just do us a favor, Nick, is you send me an email with like a biography?
Sure.
So you mentioned about 4 books, so just send me those and I'll happy to post those out and to continue that. And you've been involved with sports teams before too, right? So
yes. So and that's worth mentioning from the practitioner side. So I do some coaching, but I do a lot of consulting and training, and I've ghostwritten some exercises for an NBA executive at a couple different franchises, and primarily work with a school here in Western Michigan that is basically the powerhouse soccer program for Division II. It's called Grand Valley State University, and with them, they've won, I think, 3 of the last 5 national championships with this particular coach, and something like 5 of the last 7 or 8 overall. It's just a crazy program. And this coach will tell you, his name's Jeff Hostler. He's a good friend of mine. He'll tell you that when you think about flourishing culture, championship culture, high level culture, you cannot separate that from having a deep concern and care for how people, individuals, are thriving in that culture and how the culture is thriving collectively, right? So the simple way of saying this is to use the phrase that's the title of the textbook we use in my student elective. It's called the happiness advantage. But basically, we become better at just about everything we do when we're well, right? Like we need that bad, we need the discomfort, we need some anger, but when we're well, that's when we're most motivated, we're most creative, we're most compassionate and kind, we're open. And so what I try and do for organizations or teams or athletes is help them put some of those practices and ideas into effect so that it sort of indirectly also impacts their performance.
Wow. All right, we'll throw that book in there too, I guess, into the biography. All right, before we get to the end of this, I do want to bring it back to this like spiritual dimension, because you are talking to a rabbi. It's like you're not just hanging out with your buddy, although we're friends. You're talking to like, and for me, the work that you're doing feels very at home to me. Like it feels like we don't use the word happiness in Judaism the same way traditionally that the way you would do. I think, again, I don't even think you use the word happiness in the way that most people understand the word happiness. So our word for that tends to be either shlemut, which means wholeness or, a sense of well-being and peace. Or if you're taking a specifically religious dimension, is kedusha, which means holiness. And that a holy life is a life that isn't always good, but is a life that is alive, right? That is fully alive and in flow, like in that sort of divine flow, if you're going to use a more mystical way of looking at that. And I can't help but thinking like so many of the attributes of positive psychology, like the need for meaning, attaching yourself to a larger narrative. I can't think of a narrative that has been motivated more people in the world than the Exodus from Egypt, right? The need for naming the moment, like having a meta moment about this moment. So every time that we make a blessing over food, you're having a meta moment. Like you're actually naming, like, praise are you, God, for giving me this food. Is not just about eating the food and enjoying it. You're actually kind of like naming the thing, right? And that's a matter of gratitude, and it's a matter of like transcending the moment. And then lastly, like when someone said to me, well, what's the point of religion if all it is therapeutic? Right? Make people feel better about, say, it's sort of a Marx's argument about it being the opiate of the masses, right? Of course, Marx was never a happy person, and most of the writers about the psychology and the history and focus of religion weren't actually happy people. They had like a chip on their shoulder. And when I say to someone, what's so bad about religion if it gives a meta narrative to your life and maybe all it is therapy, but it's both negative, if you will, and positive psychology. Like that's what religion actually is, right?
And I think it speaks again back to the lobster, right? So a very good friend of mine that also works at Milken, I'm sure you know each other, but Rabbi David Sager, we would have a lot of fruta with each other. I would want to learn a lot about Judaism. He'd want to learn a lot about pause psych, in part because of what we noticed were these really obvious overlaps. And frankly, we didn't even necessarily come to it with each other. The kids started noticing it. So they would bring up topics in my class and they'd bring up my topics in his class. And so we just started chatting. And David said something to me a couple months ago when we were still on campus and seeing each other. It must have been right before a holiday. I can't remember what it was exactly. But for him, I think what is spiritual and meaningful is not always what is pleasant and happy, right? There is an effortful striving, such as maintaining kashrut, right? Keeping a kosher household that's not fun. He'd like to be eating these other things. He'd like to be drinking these other things. But that unpleasantness or maybe that discomfort is also, I think, what he would say, and I don't want to speak for him too much, would bring him closer to God and his sense of meaning and transcendence, right? So I totally agree. I don't think it is just therapeutic. I think it is very challenging and a lot of times can induce that sort of like lobster phenomenon.
Yeah.
Which is ironic that I keep using a lobster, given that we're talking about kashrut, but
That is for sure. Yeah, the way I like to think about it is that historically, when we think about the concept of mitzvah, which means commandment in Hebrew, we usually think of it as something that's kind of like imposed upon us,
Mhm.
right? Historically, that's what it's been, but it's also because the creation of religion in response to the divine encounter was only suffused through the psychological and sociological frameworks that they knew. So if your ruler is a dictator, then your God's going to be a dictator. If your ruler is a Caesar, then your God is going to be a Caesar. If your ruler is an emperor, then your God is going to be an emperor. But in an open society, hopefully that remains an open society. An open society, God is none of those things. God is not someone, the word mitzvah in that case isn't a commandment that's forced upon us, but is an invitation into meaning.
Mhm.
As Whitehead, I don't know if you ever studied Whitehead, but Whitehead basically talks about the difference between coercive power and persuasive power.
Mhm.
And that God of old is coercive, and the God that we currently, the one I like to lift up and bring into my heart, is a persuasive power.
Yeah,
So,
it's really, sorry, bee buzzing around me, but it to me, as you were saying that, the word covenant came to mind, right? It's an agreement, right? It's sort of a social contract. It's not that I have to, and I'm coming, obviously born and raised in West Michigan, and I'm not sure I met a Jewish person until college. It's very, very Christian area, and a lot of my experiences as a young person were kind of what you described, which is, you do this because if you don't make it into heaven, right? And that's sort of, to me, always seemed a compulsion, right? Or acting out of compliance, which didn't work for me personally. It works for a lot of people, but I think it speaks to sort of that tension in the way people think about and look at religion and sort of a sense of meaning and spirituality as a whole. And I'll also just mention too, spirituality, I think, or a sense of meaning does not have to be based in theology or religiosity, right? I am not a religious person, but I consider myself very spiritual, and that I acknowledge there's maybe something or someone out there, and I can't answer that question. I'm just not religious because I don't know what it is. I don't have the answers, and I don't put a label on it. But that doesn't make, I think, a person any less spiritual potentially. It just changes that narrative a little bit.
certainly. I think the difference between spirituality and religion is like the difference between, I don't know, I have to think about what the right metaphor is, but like drawing a picture of whatever you want yourself versus seeing a beautiful masterpiece in a book and feeling connected to it.
I like that.
It's a difference between unstructured self-expression and drive for transcendence and feeling connected to that sort of that piece of it versus embedding those same feelings in a historical community.
Yeah,
And that's what religion is, and that's okay. Like,
absolutely, and still getting that connection, right? I mean,
right,
and we've mentioned, we talked a lot about Aristotle, but that narrative sense of self, that communitarian sense of self, the idea that you really can attach your identity, your sense of self, or detach it, I should say, from your stories, from your history, from your narrative, your family, your friend, whatever it may be, right? To me, is one of the more beautiful sort of components or essences of Judaism, right? Is very, very communal in its very nature.
right. And in many ways, many people who aren't Jewish can't understand Judaism because, and I don't mean this in any pejorative sense, but we're a non-binary faith tradition. We are not only a religion or only a people or only a culture. We are all of those things. And at any given moment, any one of us could feel connected to one, two, three, four, five, whatever those things are. And for people who are frankly are either Christian or Muslim, which are more strict faith traditions than they are cultural traditions or faith or communitarian traditions, they don't quite understand how I can still feel connected to a Hasidic Jew in Borough Park, even though his version of Judaism and my version of Judaism don't look at all alike. And why, even though Judaism has different streams, we never say we're different religions.
That's right.
And so, like, that's a very different way of approaching it. It's much more holistic. Um, that's one of the things I like about Judaism, right? So, and of course, I want more people. Like, there is something special about using, as you say, cognitive reframing, like using a community that can cognitively frame a current experience into an ancient or embedded experience when you are feeling something deeply and you look across the room and someone who has a shared sensibility and a shared history with you, and you don't even have to say anything, and they just look at you and say, yeah, I get it too, right? There's something very powerful about that, that solitary spirituality doesn't always bring to the table.
Yeah.
And for those who don't need that, that's fine. But there are people who do need that, and why I think religion could be a very powerful and positive force for good. And that spirituality and religion are not really ever against each other. They're just different expressions of how we come to the same
It,
need for transcendence.
it brings up the phrase Brene Brown uses, who a lot of people know at this point, one of the few psychologists with a Netflix special. But collective moments, or as Rabbi David says, CMJs, collective moments of joy, collective moments of sorrow, but essentially where people are on a similar emotional plane, right? They're experiencing an emotion together. And I think that really speaks to sort of that communitarian collective nature you get from just about any religion, right? Group prayer, group observation, celebration of Shabbat, those sorts of things, I think are a big part of all religions for the most part.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely feel that way. You want anything else you want to share, Nick? Something special that's on your mind, something that you want us to kind of start to take away from this moment?
I'll mention, I'll send you an email with this too, so you can shoot it out. But for anyone listening, there's some free courses and resources available in this area right now, given COVID and the pandemic. You can check out, a lot of you have heard about the most popular class in Yale's history, which is The Science of Happiness by Dr. Laurie Santos. And she made that free on Coursera, basically as soon as the pandemic started. You can get the link to it on my website. It's under COVID-19 resources, but again, I'll send it to you as well. And then there's another one from a friend of mine, Dr. Karen Rivich, who's the Director of Resilience Programming at UPenn's Positive Psych Center. And she's also made her course on resilience on Coursera free to people right now. Those are both excellent resources, sort of self-guided, self-paced, totally free right now. So those are worth checking out if you want to dig into this and learn a little bit more.
That's wonderful. And, I was just thinking, like, as we go through this, both the protests and the pandemic are going to continue to evolve.
Mm-hmm.
And whether that means a second wave of closures, which hopefully won't happen, or some specific reform or anti-protest, like sort of so maybe, like, just to end, like, think about what the future could bring and how can we prepare ourselves for this totally unknowable future, uncertain future.
And that's a great way to finish it, because if you had to pull out one of the most core components of positive psych, it's optimism. It's optimism. It's the idea that not everything is good, not everything is fluffy, but optimism is the general belief that things will go well or things can get better. And it's the foundation of resilience. It's the opposite of learned helplessness and giving up. And it's not just saying, oh, things are okay when they're not. It's just saying the bad is here. It is happening or has happened. There's really only one choice now. Make it better. How do I take big or small steps to make it better? And then it's worth, in that way, distinguishing optimism from hope scientifically. And maybe this is something we can end on, but hope is essentially sort of two components, what we call hope agency and hope pathways. Hope pathways are, I'm optimistic about, like, things can get better, but hope pathways means I see the route forward. I have identifiable steps and strategies, right? And then hope agency is, I believe I have the motivation and energy and effort and grit to pursue those pathways, right? It's much more specific to a particular topic or issue than just general optimism are, even though they get used interchangeably. So maintain optimism. Like, yeah, things are really tough right now for a lot of us, tougher for some than others, certainly. There's only so many choices, right? And I think the only real option is to be optimistic about where we can go from here, and then try to cultivate hope by looking for specific pathways and believing that we can take big or small actions to create change.
Yeah, totally agree with that. I used to say, what's the difference between having a wish and having hope? Having a wish is a fantasy about a world that gives you no agency to get there and can't actually happen. Having hope is where you, as you say, includes a path and agency.
Yep.
And where hope and wish come together is that they both imagine a world we've never known.
That's right.
And the only people who have ever changed the world for the better have imagined a world that has never been experienced and tried to bring that experience into reality.
Well said. Absolutely.
Only optimists change the world for the better.
Right. Yeah.
I want to thank everyone who's online with us. The Schulmans say thank you. I'm going to be taking a break next week because it is Father's Day. So I take a point of personal privilege that I will be sleeping in that morning. The one Sunday a year I get to spend time by myself and with my family on my own terms. So I will be taking a break next week, but then the following week we'll come back with my good friend, Rabbi Denise Ager, who just published a new book of liturgy targeted specifically for communities that are trying to embrace the LGBTQ community. So please join us for that. Nick, it is so great to have you here. Sorry you're so far away. I wish you the absolute best in your new career, in your new phase of your career, and in your new digs in Philadelphia. Hopefully you'll come back and we'll talk again.
Thanks for having me, my friend. Always good to spend time with you and chat pos psych, religion, philosophy, sociology. This was a lot of fun. So thank you, and thanks those signed on. And Schulmans, I love you.
Okay, we'll see you guys again.